Hello, everybody. This is Brendan Kenny in Minnesota, Minneapolis area, Shakopee. I know you're asking why on earth is he sitting on the floor? Well, because I have some folding that needs to be done, and we're going to Tahoe soon, and I have trouble restraining myself when I want to talk about something. So I hope you're not terribly offended or bored if I talk a little bit as I do this, as I get this laundry in different places where it's supposed to go. So again, I am Brendan Kenny. I'm a lawyer in Minneapolis, and I'm Kenny Brendan, KENNYBRENDAN, KENNYBRENDAN in on Twitter. And as I said, I'm a lawyer in Minneapolis. I work for a firm on the civil litigation side and do product liability, mass tort, and class action on the defense side. So this criminal law isn't exactly my main area, but I do have some experience and always have thoughts about undisclosed serial dynasty and just this Adnan Syed case in general I want to share. About undisclosed, really great episode following up on the cell phone pings and the background of them, because it really became clear to me as I reread Kevin Urich's Intercept interview. The party line was, well, there were problems with Jay, but we were able to match up his testimony to something objective. And here's what struck me as I was listening to that. And a little bit later I'll get into a personal story because it struck me in a personal way. I won't say qualms of conscious, but just seeing a way I've looked at things in the past and seeing that it isn't the whole story. So what he's saying, I think, about the idea that we have Jay's testimony, and Jay's testimony is right about the main stuff and wrong about the collateral stuff, and he gets to decide what's collateral and what's main, which is a big problem to begin with. And I say that just as a trial lawyer, when it comes to impeachment, I think a lot of people are surprised just how much information is impeachment. How much you can find out about someone's location, what they did, their habits. All of it can come together to cast doubt on their character for truthfulness, or even beyond truthfulness, just accuracy when it comes to eyewitness testimony or what the person observed or what they saw. So almost anything could be material. And for him to just say, as he did in the Intercept interview, well, I looked at what was going on and I decided that anything that bared upon Jay being there with Adnan was material and anything else was collateral. It's hard to even know where to begin with that. I'm trying in my head to even fathom what that could mean. So let's back up. So we have someone for whom there's no physical evidence that ties him to the crime. There's no one who allegedly even saw him commit the crime. Jay comes out of the woodwork and said, oh, I know he committed the crime. He told me, I have this evidence, etc. So he's the person. And his word is all you've got. And they say, well, there's problems with his word because it changes. You know, there's several words. There's a different word every time we talk about everything. But what has been consistent is that he says Adnan did it. Well, that's like saying that the prosecution's theory of the case is the only thing that matters is that Adnan did it. Well, no. There's a lot more to it than that. And if Jay lies about specifics, I don't know what, I can't think of a situation where that would go more directly to what happened, because we're stuck with Jay's testimony. The thing is that, and I'm going to complete this thought, is that one thing the prosecution has never said and couldn't say is that the cell phone records alone could get Adnan. So it's not one of those things where you have some really, really strong direct evidence, whether it's DNA or something, you know, some recording, a camera, whatever. And then you have an eyewitness that maybe isn't perfect, but can back it up, or something like that. You know, we have this eyewitness who has the goods on Adnan, but he needs something to buttress up what he says so that we could believe that at least the binding of his story is true. And here's the problem. Have any of you seen the Staircase documentary? Well, and it's leading somewhere. What I'm talking about here is leading somewhere. Is the Staircase documentary is about a guy who ended up getting convicted for supposedly killing his wife by throwing her down a staircase and some other things. And what really did him in was there was a forensic analyst, and I'm getting maybe the term wrong, but basically he was a guy who worked for the state. This was North Carolina Crime Lab. And he did tests that said that, well, this is how it went down. This is how the guy did it. This is how he did it and didn't have blood. This explains the blood patterns. This is why he had blood here and why he didn't have blood there. And it was really damning. And well, I wouldn't say it was damning, but I'm saying that the jury bought it. And it was similar, I think, to what apparently happened in this case, where there was expert testimony. And it wasn't that the expert testimony did so much, but it gave the prosecution enough of an opening to tie it together in closing into something the jury could understand. And that's what happened there. That his analysis of how the blood patterns and all that made sense, that the husband could have been the killer, was really key in his conviction. Well, what do they find out in the future as they're going through the appeals process and doing FOIA requests and things like that? Well, they find out that there was a lot of weird things going on at the state crime lab, and that what happened was this forensic analyst, I would say, uncharitably maybe, dummied up a test. His approach that he took to it is he kept working this test again and again till he figured out a way how someone could have committed the crime to fit how the husband presented when the cops came, the blood pattern and everything. And then he presented that as what happened. I think that's what Kevin Urich is essentially doing. He looked at the cell phone records in a way that allowed him to come up with one possible universe, one possible world where what Jay says is true. And I am, some other time, going to go through, I think, line by line through Urich's interview, because I was reminded today in Undisclosed just how much good stuff is in there and how much telling stuff. And I think, similar to what Bob from Serial Dynasty was saying about expert witnesses, prosecutors are usually pretty smart in terms of what they say publicly about a case. And I think with Urich's it's the same. So he has himself covered for if some more things come out, as they did, about how Jay's story wasn't the way it went down. And he says, well, we have this problem, these people lie, and we just have to kind of live with it and hope we can come up with enough external evidence to show that the gist of the story is true. And one thing I find interesting, and where I'm going with this is, I'm thinking, as I'll talk about a little bit later personally, about how I look at a case and how this prosecutor and these police officers look at cases. And from my own experience, how I see sometimes law enforcement or anyone can look at a case in a biased way or in a way with tunnel vision. And here, what interests me is the tunnel vision focusing on their theory of the case, but their amazing lack of curiosity about anything else. So, essentially they're saying, well, we got this problem with Jay, and we have these cell phone records that tell us something, but we don't want to get caught up in the whole thing and get confused. Let's just focus on what we can know and what will get us where we need to get. And all what that really means is, what that leads to, is that they focus on only the stuff that can help them. And that's really a huge problem, and it's one I see running through this case. They decided, you decide what happened or who the bad guy is, and then everything gets filtered through that. And where I want to say it from a personal experience, and how this can play out, is, and I feel, I wouldn't go so far as say affinity for Kevin Urich, but I have a sense of where he's coming from. And the reason I do is before I was out here in Minnesota, I worked for the Attorney General's office in California. I was in the Correctional Law Division section. So what that meant is I was defending the state and individuals employed by the state from lawsuits brought by inmates. So that could go for class actions. That could be pro se cases where they're complaining about something relatively small, like a correctional officer broke their rap CD or something a little bit more, like they were placed in ADSEG, lockdown when they shouldn't have been, they didn't get due process. And and I've talked about this a bit, but this is an anecdote that I don't think I have. In a lot of these cases, big law firms would get involved and have some of their partner, a senior associate, and some younger associates who would get involved with the case and would work up the case for trial if it was getting to that point. And so in this case, I was on it, and the issue was whether an inmate had received proper process before he had been validated as a prison gang associate, which was a big deal because prison gangs are a big deal in California. And if you're validated as a prison gang associate and you have an indeterminate life sentence, like 15 years to life, you're pretty much not going to parole. You're going to be in a lockdown unit in what's called a security housing unit at Pelican Bay is the main one. And until you debrief, which is tell the secrets of the gang or a few other ways, you're not getting out. So I look back on me in that case, representing the state and representing people employed by the state, and there were a lot of problems that happened in this case. There was testimony that some correctional officers and sergeants made that turned out to, they contradicted themselves. There was a report relied on that even after the contents of it turned out not to be true, it was still, the substance of the report turned out not to be true. It was still relied on for other purposes. And all this is to say that to this day, when I think about the case, I think, well, maybe things didn't go the way they should have been. Maybe the guy didn't get proper process, but he was basically where he ended up kind of where he should have. And so what I mean is I have conflicted feelings. On one hand, I don't think the way the process went was right. And I definitely am not a fan of having people locked up, forever, basically, because they're validated with the prison gang. Something has to change. This crazy overcrowding is a huge problem. But when I think about the case and what I know about it, I still think of the negatives for the plaintiff, the guy on the other side. And so where I'm going with this is I'm hearing Urich talk about it, and he's saying, he's sort of echoing the way I felt at the time. Look, there's these problems. I would say there's these problems with correctional officers and cops. They are not accountants. They don't think like mathematicians. They're used to not being challenged, and they're used to being very big, broad statements, and they do very poorly at trial and in depositions and when cross-examined. So it's going to be expected that they're going to contradict themselves. But is the stem of the story true? Was the inmate, the things that were found in the cell, did he have them? Did he have those razor blades that were found in the cell? Were they planted? Are you a conspiracy theorist? And that's the sort of interaction I had with the other side and what happened in the case. So what I'm saying is I see where I don't agree with him, but I see where he's coming from, where he's saying, look, there's all these problems that we have in cases like this, and what they're pointing out, we just have to kind of live with. Okay, so that's just, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but anyway, it seemed important to me when I was writing it down. But why is that such a problem in this case? Well, I want to give an example, an anecdote from my own life that shows this misunderstanding that Kevin Urich has with collateral and material information. And one of the last times I talked, last time or the time before, I talked about a time of being unfairly accused of something very silly, of stealing gum. This is back when I was 7 or 8. And I thought, as I was sitting there, I thought, well, what if, that someone had it in for me, and they decided they were going to get me for stealing gum, even though I didn't steal gum. And they had a star witness, this guy who said, hey, you stole gum, and kept saying it. And let's assume that every time they talked to him, the story changed. It was a different time, it was a different place, it was a different way I stole gum. The conversations I had with him were different, and we get to some sort of trial, and the prosecutor said, well, none of that stuff matters. What matters is that this guy said he saw Brendan steal gum. And that's all that matters. And we know from some records, from eyewitness testimony, maybe even surveillance records, that at some point that day they were together. They were in the same store at the same place. And unless there's something that shows they weren't together, we have enough for our case. And that's how I feel like everything, it's gone down in this case. And that's what struck me from this episode and from the interview with Kevin Urich. And I think that's really how, as this case progressed and they saw all these problems, how they dealt with it. I want to talk about experts. I tweeted today, I looked up the expert that was the prosecution's cell phone expert in Adnan Syed case, because one of the things that Bob pointed out in Serial Dynasty is that the way things went with this expert is different than most expert witnesses behave, for, in my experience, a very simple reason. If you're an expert witness and you do things that are consistently sort of shoddy, biased, and you lose credibility, no one wants to hire you. You have to at least have the illusion of objectivity. And there's all sorts of things that people do as experts to sort of show that they're not biased. They'll be very careful about how they do reports. They'll try to seem at least like they work equally for both sides, which many times they don't. But the lengths they go to show that are remarkable, and I've talked about that before, where they will, there's so many things that they'll do. I won't even get into that now. But this guy, you don't see any of that. And I looked him up on Westlaw and some other places, and as far as I can tell, he had never testified in any other case. And I said, that explains a lot. Well, what it explains is that he behaved a lot differently than expert witnesses usually do, because he's not really an expert witness. He's not a testifying expert witness. And it also jogged a feeling from the past, because when you're representing the state, you have a lot of advantages that I didn't consider at the time. And one is that the people who are in the know about a lot are either directly or indirectly aligned with your side. So, for instance, in this case I was working on, all the gang experts, the people who are experts on prison gangs, work for the state. Or they directly, or they do work for the state. So they're not going to get in a case and testify for plaintiff. And I was very critical of, and for good reason, for the expert witness that the plaintiffs used. But he was really the only one in a correctional setting who testified for plaintiffs. And I apologize for my voice. I have a cough and whatever. And I just got the feeling of that in this case, that you are in a position, because I was in a position where I would have expert witnesses who were not really typically testifying expert witnesses. They knew a lot about prison gangs or something like that, but they didn't usually testify. And they had a whole different approach to these things. And my difficulty was getting them to be more careful about what they said. It was, I think, different than Kevin Urich's difficulty. But what struck me was, you might remember, and I've been talking about this a lot lately, about how, what was her name? Oh, forgetting her name. The person from the Innocence Project that Sarah Koenig interviewed. Deirdre. And she said that an innocent person is the worst person you could have as a client when you're a defense attorney because they don't know anything. I thought, that's so true. I thought about that for a second with an alibi. You know, they don't know what they have to avoid. If they committed the crime, they know where they did it. They just need to get themselves someplace else. They need to do something else. So it's almost simpler if you're guilty to get away with it in a way. And that's what struck me when we're talking about expert witnesses. Someone who you're qualified as an expert witness to testify at trial, the worst person to do that typically is someone who's never done it before. Unless you're trying to pull something over on people. Then the person who's never done it before is perfect because you can manipulate, massage, whatever their testimony in such a way that you can plant seeds or get enough of a colorable basis to make an argument to say what your argument really is. Because in that circumstance, you're not trying to get the expert witness at trial to say what your argument really is. You're trying to plant some seeds so that in closing you can make your real argument, which actually isn't supported by the expert testimony. And that makes a lot more sense out of this. If you check out on the Undisclosed podcast, they actually have the report that Kevin Urich wrote. Urich, I think I'm mispronouncing it. Anyway, he wrote that report, the oral one where the expert said stuff out loud and they wrote it down. And I can just imagine this guy who's never testified before, who's the legal field, the courtroom, this whole thing is completely foreign. And he's just sitting there and he's just going on and saying, well, I guess this is the way things are done. And then he gets to trial. And, you know, he'll admit things on cross, whatever. He's very honest. I certainly got that impression. He was very honest. He wasn't trying to pull one over on anybody. But because of that, he was able to be used by the prosecution to put some ideas in people's minds and use them at the end. I'm repeating myself, but I think that's really what it is. So there's a connection. You know, if you're a lawyer, in a sense, an innocent client is the worst to have. And also, as a lawyer, an inexperienced expert witness is the worst to have unless you're trying to do something improper. Okay, I wanted to say that. I talked about my story. Yes. The other thing I wanted to talk about is memory. And the reason I thought about this is there's a lot of talk on Twitter about what Serial did and what it didn't do, what its shortcomings were, how it is compared to Undisclosed or Serial, Dynasty, or the other podcasts. And I got to thinking, a few months ago I re-listened to Serial. I think I probably listened to it 3 times or something. I thought, why don't I listen to some of it again and see what it's really about? And I did, and I was shocked. Well, not shocked. I was a little surprised because when I talked about the Generation Y podcast, I complimented them because they started out talking about Hay and who Hay was, and I felt like no one had really done that, which seemed to be part of the narrative. But then I re-listened to Serial. My gosh, 2 episodes are all about Hay. But in my defense, I think what I did is they had a different approach, and some of their facts were wrong about Hay. And because I heard that, it felt like something new, which it was. Because the whole thing about her, never really, the gist I got from it was she got along with everyone, including her parents and all that. And I was sort of taken by that a little bit. I thought, well, I'd never really heard this. Well, it's different information. But when I listened to the first 2 episodes of Serial, I thought, wow, there's a lot about Hay in here. And there's a lot about memory. It's kind of amazing, and I think it was Crime Writers on Serial. I'm not sure. But somewhere in the middle, one of the guys on there was saying, I hope this Serial podcast doesn't end with a thought about memory and how we can't really know anything and life's a mystery. And I thought, wow, we were to the point halfway through the Serial podcast where we thought that's where it was going. And so it told me a lot that I've forgotten maybe what I think I remember what the Serial podcast was about, but I really don't. Because, and I think the reason is, because I've been so influenced by the narrative it's set that I take that for granted. And I don't realize that that's what the narrative's from. And that's where I want to go with some of the, not criticism, but some of the stuff that have been said about Sarah Koenig and the Serial podcast. In terms of contrasting it with Undisclosed and saying, well, Undisclosed has done all this and Serial did this, and Serial podcast should have gone farther. And I love Undisclosed. Anyone who's listened to me knows that. I love Serial podcast, Serial Dynasty podcast. But what I think is being missed is that I don't think any of us could be here today if it wasn't for Serial podcast. Now, I don't mean no one would be fighting this fight. Rabia would be fighting this fight, and maybe other people would be getting involved. But for the rest of us, the narrative was set by Serial. And all the major parts of this narrative that we're focusing on today, I think, was set by the Serial podcast. The problem with memory, the problem with Jay, of course, the problem with what people remember, the problem with who this guy Adnan is. And that's set. We've taken it for granted, and now in hindsight, we're kind of criticizing to some degree the Serial podcast because we're assuming that this narrative was already existed, but it was a Serial podcast that created it. And to give an analogy, I've read studied a little bit about Citizen Kane, right? And so many things that are part of films now were invented, never existed before in Citizen Kane, never dreamed of before Citizen Kane. And I can't get into all of them now because I probably would mistake them. But if I went back and didn't realize that and watched Citizen Kane, I might have some criticisms. I'm like, well, why does it do this? This is kind of hokey. Not realizing that it's the first thing to ever do it. And connected with that, I want to talk a little bit about persuasion in Serial. Because I think that the reason why there's so much momentum on the pro Adnan side right now, in the public, in all this crowdsourcing, in the movement to show that he's innocent, is because some of the goals of Serial podcasts were so modest. And what I mean by that, modest in the sense that I think Sarah Koenig was very aware from her years at This American Life of what makes a good story and how important it is to have the trust and the respect of the listener. And that's why I think she was so careful about this stuff. But the facts she presented started people thinking, and people could go from there. And I'm thinking specifically about the anti-Muslim, anti-Pakistani bias. A lot of people have had some criticism for her that she sort of suggested that she didn't buy, that it played a big part in it. And that when Adnan's mother told her that this was totally, a set-up job, she didn't, respond exactly like, oh, I totally agree with you. And I don't know, I feel very strongly about this, very strongly, is that because she didn't, it gave the show so much more credibility. Because she put herself in a position, and some people feel like this is privilege, or this is that. I don't think that. I mean, I don't even understand exactly what privilege means. It's used a lot of different ways, so I'm not going to get into that. I'm not saying I disagree, I just don't really understand it. I've seen it used about 10 different ways. But what she did is she said, look, I have a responsibility. I'm writing this story. I'm not going to tell you how to think or whatever, and everyone can believe what they want, and you, the person I'm interviewing, might be completely right. But my responsibility, I almost answer to a higher power. I'm not saying religiously necessarily, but I have to answer for myself. I can't just accept someone else's beliefs, even if they may well be right. I have to come to that determination on my own, and I have to allow my listeners to. And that's, I think, what she did. And if she hadn't, I think, if she had taken a hard line on some of these things that right now, I think most of us are pretty comfortable agreeing with. Most of us are pretty comfortable agreeing that they had it in for Adnan, and some of it, at some level, was anti-Muslim, anti-Pakistani bias, or at least using that as a tool to convict him. But if she had done that without laying out the work and allow others to fill it in, I don't think it would have been very effective. And a lot of people wouldn't have trusted her as much as a storyteller. I wouldn't have, because I had to do my own research to find that to be the case. And why? Well, the reason is back to memory, and back to experience. A few times ago, and I know I'm going on and on, but I am going to wrap up. A few times ago, I talked about the last, or the time before, the Undisclosed podcast, where they got into how everything went down for Adnan in the house search and the trial. And I was outraged. But if I hadn't had the framework and the narrative of Serial and all the information there and all the interviews, and cold going into that, all that information had been presented to me. This was terrible. This was this was that. I wouldn't have had that reaction. Not because I'm pro-cop, not because I don't believe prejudice exists, but because I know that when a person experiences something and they're not part of the system or they're not used to this, things can appear a certain way. And the way the person experiences them can very well be true. But the conclusions they draw from that doesn't have to be true. And one is, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of SWAT team raids. There are a lot of house searches. There's a lot of crazy stuff that cops do. And it happens to people all the time. Now, to the person who experiences it, does it seem like this is a experience that is pinpointed on them for all sorts of nefarious reasons? Yes, certainly. But that doesn't mean that's the whole story. Now, am I saying it's right? No. I think all these SWAT team raids are horrible. To give an example, when I was in college, some very close friends from high school got in big trouble, believe it or not, for making fake IDs. They weren't even making much money out of it, but they went too far, and people everywhere had these fake IDs, and it was friends of friends. And the police staked out their place and came in, I mean, like SWAT team style, like these people were hardcore criminals or something. We're going to have guns or something. So this stuff happens a lot. So what I'm saying is, when I listen to Serial, when I'm listening to Serial talking about Adnan being taken away and the raid, I'm thinking, well, that's terrible they did it that way. But this happens all the time. And if I hear his mom saying how terrible it is, my gosh, am I sympathetic? Yes, totally sympathetic. Totally sympathetic. But I'm not going to necessarily draw the conclusion she draws until I know more. And so that's why I love how this story is unfolded. Because we have this structure that Sarah provided, and then Undisclosed comes along and said, remember that structure? Oh, let's give you this, that, and the other thing. And you say, whoa, this really was bad. Whoa, his mom really was right. Not just right in the sense of the way she experienced it, but in the way it really went down. This was not like any other rape. And if Sarah had just said, this is what the person says, this is her experience, who am I to judge? I'm just saying for me, and maybe I'm not the target audience, or maybe I'm a lost cause, I don't know. I wouldn't have responded the way I've responded now. But that restraint that she had is so powerful, so powerful. And I think it's the thing I really liked about the show. And why do I say that? Because as a lawyer, some of the most effective things I've ever seen happen have been from restraint. And you see that in movies, too. I'd take an example. If any of you have seen The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, the way it all went down is there's a socialite who it turns out is gay, but that's kind of an important part of the story. But he shoots, he kills somebody, and he's on trial for it. And there's a particular person who's, maybe I'm misremembering it a little, who's a prosecution witness. And he has some credibility problems, sort of like Jay. He's a criminal, he's done all this stuff. And I'm not saying it's right the way it went, but it came out obviously this guy was the kind of guy that would look for older men who had money and would sleep with them and everything and get gifts. He wasn't, that was kind of thing. And he was holding himself out as like this was in the South, this was in Savannah. He had accepted Jesus and all this stuff had happened. And at the very end, the prosecutor said, well, I'm not trying to be indelicate, but when was the last time you had a sexual experience from an older man when you were getting a gift? And he says, oh, sir, I have been free from that behavior for 5 weeks. And the guy questioned the defense lawyer basically said, oh, bless your heart. Good for you. So the gist of it, why that was so effective was, he was presenting himself as this guy who was a liar, who was using men to get stuff, who was not in love with any of these guys or anything. And he's 5 weeks removed from that behavior. And now he's the prosecutor's witness, and we're supposed to believe what he says. Now, if the guy had laid into him, like Christina Gutierrez laid into Jay, I think it would have been much more ineffective. So it worked really well. I've got a lot more to say, but it's going to be in another episode, and I've got to clean and do stuff. So at some point, I'm going to figure out how to set things up so you guys can ask questions if you have any or comments. But I got to head out now. I will upload this to YouTube. And I am on Twitter at Kenny, Kenny, Brendan, Kenny, Brendan. Have a great night.